But they said a recent study showed that horses will rebuild glycogen stores much faster when they get salt and electrolytes in a solution right after the bout of exercise.
Welcome everyone to episode 93 of the Send Nutrition Podcast. You're with your hosts Bryan and Peter, and today our podcast is on feeding the endurance horse fat and fibre for optimal performance. How are you, Peter?
Bryan, it's been a very quiet week. I'm on the green matcha teas and just looking after my health. I've been battling a cough, so hopefully it all goes to plan with today's podcast, I should say.
So you've put the gin to one side?
The gin's been put into retirement.
We got Christmas coming up, so it is the summer of gin, I think.
I might have to give it a comeback. Eh?
We do have a Christmas party too, Pete.
yeah, don't remind me. All right, look, getting into business, feeding endurance horse. So Magellan's been actively working with quite a few more endurance riders, competitors, even farms as well that have jumped onto the Send Feed program. And we did do a podcast initially. I think it was episode 17.
Yeah, I think so. Way back when. Yeah.
When we first sort of kicked off. But we thought, a version 2.0 just to maybe update with all the information that we previously, but just sort of where the cutting edge science is and what's changed since we've done that podcast itself.
Yeah, this podcast aims to step you through from the pre-training and conditioning of the endurance horse all the way through to post-race, like when you're in the competition, but then also equally what you should be feeding after the event. And I think that episode 17, Pete, we just went really into the muscle fibers, but today we'll focus on the whole diet setup, why we feed more fat and fiber, and this will give you guys a really good edge when it comes to competing your endurance horse.
Yeah, look, I give credit to every endurance horse owner and competitor there, because the thing is, if you don't do the groundwork and you don't feed correctly, there's nowhere to hide, especially when you're going sort of 160 plus kilometers. I'm sure there's longer races than that, but it's not like 1,000-meter thoroughbred race where you could pull a horse out of a paddock and still be competitive. I think in this one you really got to know what you're doing, and look, from the research that we did for this podcast as well, a lot of endurance competitors actually are very switched on with their diets and obviously treating the horse as an individual, and then obviously tweaking what that particular horse needs.
100%, Peter. These performance athletes, they really need the very best in nutrition. Owners need to understand why they're feeding this particular way, and there's so many aspects to the body, and when they're put under that sustained speed for endurance length, so kilometers, tens of kilometers on end, you don't want them to run out of gas, you don't want them to become dehydrated, and you want them to be at their very best even towards the end.
Yeah, as I said previously, there's nowhere to hide there. So, Bryan, just moving right along, I think we got to break this up into maybe two sections. Maybe we can focus on maybe the first section in terms of the daily feeding regime for what the horse will require, building fitness up to the event, and then obviously in part two, we could possibly go into maybe like a mock diet of what the horse should be getting fed on competition day.
Yeah, that sounds good, Peter. So when we look at your competition or your endurance event that you're training for, you got to really plan several weeks out. It is even months out for this whole training program. And when you're looking at your nutrition setup for this, it needs to be consistent and to what your horse eats in particular, but also basing it around sufficient forage and a very good quality forage in that.
Yeah, that's well said, Bryan. I'm going to let the cat out of the bag before it starts attacking the couch here. But a lot of the feeds on the market, as we sound like a broken record, are grain based, and we'll go through obviously the detail why a high grain diet does not suit an endurance horse.
Yeah, and probably the first secret to setting up your endurance horse diet is a good quality, high quality forage. And this forage is probably what you want to be feeding both in training and in competition, so the horse is familiar with it when it's under the stress of performance.
100%, Bryan. And the reason for that, I'll go in a little bit deeper. So basically, if you can imagine, the horse's hindgut, which is located beyond the small intestine, what it does, it breaks down fiber from forage and it creates energy. So you don't need just oats or corn or anything else. Fiber itself, hay/pasture, will get converted into energy itself. And what happens, Bryan, this energy source is very constant rather than sporadic, and it doesn't create those insulin spikes, with like kids having cordials, which is gonna make your horse a lot more easier to control and a lot more manageable and less excited.
Yeah, it's creating a more stamina nutrition profile. So we're in endurance. We want to promote stamina without those insulin spikes and accessing those glycogen stores too early, because you want a sustained release of energy from that continual breakdown of fiber, which supplies the body with short chain fatty acids. And then the body of the horse uses this for energy. But also, on another hand, fiber also holds water, so it acts like a sponge and it keeps the horse hydrated in that whole hindgut environment. So you've got the best of both worlds, getting that ad lib roughage, that really good quality hay and pasture. You're hitting two parts, or two very important parts of an endurance horse.
Yeah, Bryan, I found that part really interesting too, with the fibre acting like a sponge, but it does sort of make sense. So when you wet down a lupin pellet, for argument's sake, it does hold a lot of water. It does hold a lot of water and it does fluff up. So, we see it sort of firsthand. I think you've done a video with that as well.
And what you're looking for is really high quality fibre sources. So grassy hay is what we really recommend. If your horse is a little bit fussy, a mixed grass around 30% lucerne is probably the max you want to be, because of the calcium, and we'll touch on the protein levels later on. But you want to avoid the cereal hays like the barley hay, the oaten hay. It's just unnecessary sugars and starches in those profiles that we don't need in an endurance horse diet. Like, they may eat it, but it is the candies of the hay. We promote the more grassy native grass hays to be the quality source of forage, which really helps metabolically throughout the endurance horse's system.
It's a double-edged sword for the endurance horse owner in terms of the hays, like you said. Like, sometimes it's better the devil. Well, you're going to give it a sugary hay. Yeah, it's going to eat it, but it's going to build so much lactic acid that it's going to get tired and it's not performing properly. So, as Bryan mentioned, a grassy hay, they're numerous. You've got Rhodes grass, you've got cocksfoot, you've got teff. There's a few other sort of native pastures to different areas. Try to focus on that. Bryan, do you want to let our listeners know why we don't recommend straight lucerne for the endurance horse?
Yeah, we do have many endurance horse diets that come in and they're just feeding straight lucerne and they're not getting the desired results. There's two reasons for this. There's really high calcium, and concentrated calcium in lucerne throws out that calcium to phosphorus ratio, and the horse is working harder. So it just upsets the horse's body systems when it's trying to normalize calcium levels in the body when that lucerne's not available. So the horse does get into a bit of a metabolic problem when prolonged use of just straight lucerne. The other part of lucerne is it's really high in protein. High levels of this in endurance horses, it's just not good, because the excess protein, it gets broken down, excreted into the urine, and it increases the horse's water requirements, which is really not good in an endurance horse, because that's a big risk for dehydration. So feeding too much lucerne can equal dehydration if you don't manage it properly. So we recommend the grassy hays, or really lower the lucerne volume.
Yeah, and it's also putting unwanted stress on the kidneys, because the kidneys working overtime to try to excrete that extra protein. And as Bryan mentioned, it's it has to get rid of it through urine. That means it's drinking more, and the last thing you want is to be putting that horse into mild dehydration, because what you're feeding is causing the actual problem itself.
Yeah, and another thing, Pete, is when a horse breaks down protein, it creates more internal heat, and that's more heat than when they break down a simple carbohydrate or fat metabolism. So it's really counterproductive. You're heating the horse from the inside, and you're in a hot climate trying to compete over long distances. It's just really not an efficient way to feed, and that's why the grassy hays are very important.
Yeah, even Equitana, I think Carol Layton there was doing a presentation, and she mentioned that the lucerne can get with a calcium to phosphorus ratio 15-1 as well.
Yeah, it's right up there, and it's a really fine line with the balance if you're feeding straight lucerne, so we just don't recommend it.
So, Bryan, the next part, as your training is progressing and your horse is getting fitter, obviously it's got a lot more requirements in terms of vitamins and minerals. Do you want to let our listeners know what they should be feeding on top of their hay or pasture ration?
Yeah, so hay alone will not provide the recommended daily levels that is required for a horse in work to be at their optimal best. So then you look at your horse, you look if it's an easy keeper or a hard keeper, and you can get concentrates or feeds like the Sen CF50 or the Sen grain free, but that will really help balance the whole profile. And the one thing about Sen is we're 100% grain free, so you're not going to add to those insulin spikes with a sugar or starch based hard feed.
Yeah, and I think when our listeners are thinking of adding the grain-free or the CF50 on competition day, it's probably too late. You've got to get it into their system. You've got to get it into the bloodstream. You've got to get them repairing all their muscles and fibers and things like that. So it's good to start that protocol pretty early. Obviously, we've got the recommended feeding amounts depending on the work that you're doing. And what that is, that's an insurance policy to make sure that obviously those horses are redlining with their competition, but also the training will be quite intense. And it's very easy for that horse to fall into a vitamin mineral deficiency if it's not up to date daily. So obviously, as Bryan mentioned, if you've got a good do it, the CF50, even obviously, at the recommended feed amount, it might be from 100 grams to 250 grams. But if your horse does struggle to keep condition on, you've got the grain free, obviously, which is a less concentrated vitamin mineral source, but you have got the added fiber there, which obviously will help with the endurance event as well.
Yeah, that's spot on, Peter. And to complement this even further, we also add a fat source, and a really healthy fat source that has one that's high in omega-3. It's not chemically extracted like some typical corn or even rice bran oils. And what we're trying to do is promote the very best in health during that training, but also in recovery. So we recommend the sen oil on top of this, and combining the forage, the grain-free hard feed, and the oil is one of the best basic foundations for an endurance horse.
Yeah, it's pretty much balanced. Like, I think personally, it's the optimal diet for the endurance industry, and the reason for that is, I might sort of go a bit off tangent, and I might sort of lose a few people here, but in terms of the muscle fibers, which we discussed in the original podcast, is those Arabian endurance horses, they've got a lot more type 2A muscle fibers, which are aerobic. And if you look at that, the endurance event itself, it's 95% aerobic energy. And the way that you fuel aerobic energy with nutrition is fiber and fat. So if your race is 90% aerobic, why are you not feeding 90% for aerobic energy through fiber and fat? And that's the sen grain free, that's the sen oil, obviously your pasture and your hay. So if you're feeding, a grain-based diet for a race that's 90% aerobic, you're putting a handbrake on your horse. So you're actually slowing it down, obviously not intentionally, but you have got a handbrake on that horse just because the fuel source is not the right fuel for that particular energy event.
Yeah, spot on, Peter. And a grain-based diet, it is known that compared to a high-fat, high-fiber one, you're running into temperament risks. Like those insulin spikes can really upset the focus of the horse, and it's been observed many times that a high-fat, high-fiber diet, the horse is more tractable, it responds better, and it's a lot more alert than one fed with those high NSC diets and makeup. And with endurance horses, we believe this is very important.
Yeah, and it also spars the glycogen stores too, Bryan, as we'll probably go into later as well. It does take, on average, 8 to 10 weeks for the horse to start using fat as energy. So once again, if you're going to add the oil 4 weeks before you're competing, you're probably not going to get as much benefit out of it if you did start it at the 10-week mark. So if you are going to add a fat, or you are using a fat, that's great. But if you are going to add one into it, make sure it's at least 10 weeks before you compete.
Yeah, and one strategy with your endurance horse and the training, so say you're week 1 to 4, you're doing your initial training, you'll include all these aspects of the diet in a lower volume. So the horse is getting used to eating this profile of feed, so the fat, fiber, the forage. So then when you are getting them into a higher amount of workload, there is stress on the body, they can lose their appetite. But if they're familiar with their feed and they like it, then they're more likely to stay on it. And then you won't run into problems with conditioning through that higher workload time.
Yeah, and also too, Bryan, as you mentioned before, you're not going to get that horse winding up or being erratic or sort of wasting energy where it shouldn't be wasting. So, for an event, it could be 160 plus kilometers long. The last thing you want to have is a horse in the knee that's unsettled and it's trying to run away or just being a clown,
Yeah, no, 100%, Peter. What we do find is you have to treat every endurance horse as an individual. You've got the easy keepers, you've got the hard keepers. When you do have a hard keeper, and there may not be enough energy in that forage, fat, fiber source. So we can recommend a grain on top of this, and our grain of choice is oats. It's got a better digested starch level than corn or barley, and many nutritionists recommend this on top of a good foundation, which can be adjusted to the workload, and it'll actually replenish the glycogen stores very quickly on those long, hard rides. And we believe this is really important because the rest of the feed doesn't contain high levels of starch and sugars, adding those oats, you can really balance it easy, and you're not going to run the risk of metabolic issues.
Yeah, no, that's well said. And just for our listeners out there too, around about 300 ml of oil is almost the equivalent of about 1 kilogram of oats in terms of energy. So you imagine having your horse eat a full kilo of oats, which might take a while, but if you mix the oil through the feed with the oats, obviously, that's going to have a lot more dense energy, as we said, without the insulin spikes and what so forth. But I think you need both. And what we're trying to do here is we're trying to use the fat and fiber first as the energy, and then we want to dip into the glycogen stores at the very end of the event. And how it works is if you don't have the fat and fiber throughout the event, then you're going to dip into the glycogen stores a lot earlier, which means your horse is fatiguing a lot earlier, which means that it's not going to be running as long on the aerobic energy and the type 2A muscle fibers, which then means it's not going to be as competitive, or you're not getting the best ability out of that particular horse.
Yeah, 100%, Peter. And when the horses during that competition or during that ride, they do have those checkpoints where they can eat, and they can't eat enough to fuel the full ride. So what we're trying to do is feed calories that can be stored in the horse's fat, muscles and liver, and then they can be burned for energy as the ride progresses or as the competition progresses. If the horse doesn't have enough glycogen or blood glucose during the work, they will fatigue earlier. And then so during those checkpoints or those feed points, having a nice balance of fat, fiber, and some starch is pretty important, because so when the horse is in heavy work and provided, say, the oats, there won't be an insulin spike. The body actually uses it or mobilizes it as energy instantly. So there's no negative metabolic effect during that time. And you're also just replenishing those stores in an instant.
Yeah, that's well said. And even on top of that, Bryan, you might add 150, 200 mils of oil into those oats. So now you've taken X amount of oats, and obviously times 3 energy wise with the oil. So if they add 100 mil into the feed, into the oats, you're going to get 3 times more energy as well. So I agree with Bryan. We don't advocate feeding starch or oats too often, but I think in this instance, just to replenish what's been lost, and you've only got a limited window as well to get as much feed into that horse itself. So you got to use that wisely for the next leg of the event.
Yeah, 100%, Peter. And the overarching thing on top of all this is hydration, and the whole base diet should contain sufficient amount of salt and then electrolyte on top, depending on your workload. So why do we recommend salt? Salt helps activate thirst. It actually pulls fluid or water inside the cells to then properly hydrate the horse. That hydration is absolutely imperative for all muscle contractions everywhere around the body. Otherwise, the horse's performance will suffer. So we recommend a base maintenance of 10 grams per 100 kg body weight. So around 50 grams a day for a horse in maintenance with salt. But then depending on the workload during the day, they may need extra electrolytes, which can be in the form of our low feed rate electrolyte that has no sugar and no fillers.
Yeah, I'd also one for the point onto that, Bryan, is I'd probably double those the electrolytes probably 3 days leading into the event, because you don't want to have that horse going into such a grueling event even slightly dehydrated. And look, if they are hydrated and you give them the double dose on the 3 days, all they're going to do is just going to come out in a urine. But if your horse is slightly dehydrated, you don't want to have a horse going into a big event like that dehydrated, because it's only going to limit its performance.
Yeah, 100%, Peter. There's many aspects to the endurance horse that the owner has to think about, but what we've just discussed is a really simple foundation that is more efficient in energy for the horse, and we have a reason of feeding each aspect for better performance, and then also to promote stamina, and then have the very best energy even to the end of the ride.
Yeah, I think from the feedback that we've had, obviously from Equitana and even sort of Magellan, talking to a lot of endurance sort of customers, most people don't look at the back of the feed bag to see what their feeding actually contains. And obviously, I think we've done a podcast on this before, where the fiber aspect is the parent one that the one all the owners should be looking at. And look, the higher the fiber, the lower the sugar and starch, and the lower the fiber, the higher the sugar and starch. So don't get fooled with all the fancy marketing and all the big words like the cool and calm, because the industry isn't fully regulated. So just because it's got cool and calm on the bag does not mean that that the feed is actually going to be low in sugar.
It's quite crazy what we discover, hey, Pete.
Yeah, and we could probably do a full podcast on that, which we might one day.
Might need to be censored.
yeah, we don't want to get banned off here.
No, but getting back to the endurance horse, we recognize everyone is an individual. We really formulate the diets to your environment, your workload, the way the horse responds to it. But as the owner of the horse, you know them the best, and you can find that right puzzle piece through their training, through competition, and then even after the ride is even important as well.
Yeah. Bryan, there was a study here with one of the notes that I had, and I don't have the actual journal itself, but they said a recent study showed that horses will rebuild glycogen stores much faster when they get salt and electrolytes in a solution right after the bout of exercise that has depleted the glycogen stores.
Yeah, that's fantastic information and shows and highlights why electrolytes are so important, and particularly for endurance horses, the timing in training and in competition is really important.
Bryan, do you want to maybe address, and this is a common topic with some horses stressing. So you're also obviously on a way to the event, but also at the event itself. We have had a little bit of research that we've come across in terms of like high gut buffers and obviously probiotics and prebiotics to help with stress and travel.
Yeah, what we've found is providing a good digestive supplement that has good live probiotics, prebiotics, but also some marine source calcium. It really helps that whole environment cope with the stresses of travel and getting to the event. And that may be one strategy, either the Sen Extra Balance or the Sen Ulcer Protect, depending on the horse's symptoms or their susceptibility to digestive upsets. So this can even be further by keeping the horse comfortable so that it eats enough forage on the travel as well, because we want to keep that movement of fibre through the body to the start of the competition.
And also absorption of the nutrients. So obviously with a product like the Extra Balance with a lot of probiotics and prebiotics, it's naturally going to help with the absorption of nutrients. But also, as we mentioned before, 70% of the horse's immune system is in its gut. So it's paramount to have that gut, really, really, really healthy, especially heading into, such a grueling event.
Yeah, stress plays a big negative part on that whole microbiome makeup, and products like the Sen Extra Balance really help strengthen it in these times of these stressful events before the performance.
And Bryan, just maybe to sum it up, so obviously the riders had the event, they've come home, obviously they've got to feed the horse and obviously, work out what they do for the next 2 or 3 days. So what we'd recommend is don't just, lock the horse into a box and, leave it for 3 days, doing nothing. It's paramount to get that lactic acid out of those legs, and whether it's just walking in a big paddock or you take the horse for a trot or you lunge it or something like that, make sure that you keep that horse moving to get all that lactic acid out of its legs and out of its body. And also don't be scared to give it a little bit of starch, because obviously a lot of even though you might have given oats at the pit stops or at the vet checks, it's probably wise to give it a little bit of starch maybe for 1 or 2 days after the actual event itself. So, on the night or maybe the day after. And it's just to replenish what they've used up on a grueling event. Yeah.
And in your training, even when you get to the harder work periods or the longer work periods, also introduce that starch source as well. So it's not unfamiliar to the horse's digestive system, because you don't want their first exposure to that to be in competition and the stress of it. So have a strategy, work with it through your training, then be consistent in your competition. But then, as Peter said, also after the competition, they really require those stores to be replenished, especially the electrolytes and the glycogen stores. And that's a really good tip for anyone looking at getting the optimal result, but also the optimal recovery out of their endurance horse.
Yeah, and look, and if someone out there is lucky enough to have horse scales at their property, if you're going to throw your horse on the scales, the night of or the next day, you're probably going to go, wow, like it's just lost 20, 30 kilograms. Just be mindful that that's fluid loss mainly. It's not muscle or fat or anything like that. So within a week, that fluid loss should come back to normal. But that's where, as Bryan mentioned, the electrolyte obviously at least 2 or 3 days from the event to help that body obviously pull that water into the cells to help rehydrate the horse again.
Yeah, 100%, Peter. So in summary, feeding the hardworking endurance horse, it's as much as art as it is science. Like, there's no one size fits all. Every horse or every endurance horse should be treated as an individual, depending on their genetic makeup, the way they respond to certain environments, the way they respond to certain roughages or feeds. And here at Sen, we're here to help. And if you have any questions going forward with your endurance horse diet, we consult many owners per week through our online phone consults, which is really easy through our website. And it's all about experimenting with the diet through your training, going with what their response is, and then making those adjustments or fine-tuning the feed amounts for your particular horse. And if you do that, you're kind of like a scientist. You're trying to do some testing on your own horse to get the most optimal performance, and then knowing what is the right base foundation, you're actually going to look after the horse's health in the long run.
Yeah, and just my sort of parting message, Bryan, I think for the take-home message for our competitors here, or even people that have got endurance horses, is just keep in mind that when you do compete or you go for really long pleasure rides, 90% of that particular event or your pleasure ride is going to be using aerobic energy. So that's using oxygen. A lot of the endurance horses have got a lot more aerobic muscle fibers to what any other horse does. So what we're trying to say is fuel those muscle fibers, fuel that event with a energy source that's designed for that. And what that is, that's fat and fiber, and that's from your grain-free to your lupin pellet to your sentinel to your roughage. That's the simplest way of it. Obviously, for that 10% that Bryan mentioned, you need to replenish those glycogen stores. That's where we'd recommend a starch source like oats just to top up those glycogen stores or keep them in prime condition. And my last point is just whatever feed you're feeding, check the back of the bag. The higher the fiber, aim for a feed at least 30% fiber. That will tell you that it's a feed normally low in sugar and starch. So if you're feeding a feed that's 10% fiber, chances are the sugar and starch are going to be 20 or 30%.
Yeah, and I'll just add one little note is, here at Sen, we set ourselves apart with a fixed recipe, so we don't use seasonal ingredients. We're 100% grain-free. We're not using cereal byproducts or hiding any grain in there, because how do we achieve that high fiber, 35% in the Sen grain-free, really low sugar and starch? And we want what's best for the horse's system. We don't want any unwanted sugars and starches or fillers in those feeds, and we want a quality Australian-made product supporting the Australian farmers, and that's what we're achieving week in, week out with many performance horses.
And that goes throughout all our supplements too with the electrolyte. Obviously, we've got the lowest feed rate on the market at 25 grams because there isn't any sugars, fillers, carriers throughout all the supplements.
Yep, so that about wraps that up, Pete. We'll have another podcast to everyone very soon.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.